morning, everyone. Thanks to the ERF management for organizing these sessions and also inviting me to speak about the new normal of the global economy and growth agenda for MENA countries. My job is to, following in the footsteps of Mustafa Nabli, to talk about what are the potentials under the new normal. I decided to first sort of list the characteristics of the potential characteristics of the future economy in the next couple of decades, or mostly in the coming decade. What should we expect? And then based on that, try to see what implications can I derive about growth agenda in the Middle East and North Africa. A lot of what the result that I'm going to arrive at are similar to Mustafa's, but I arrive at them somewhat differently and with some differences in detail. So first thing that comes to mind is probably low or moderate oil prices in the coming decades, likely persistence of low interest rates. I think that's another very important concern about or maybe opportunity for in the coming decades. The reason for this, as you know, is increased supply of savings, trying to seek safe assets. And there doesn't seem to be adequate investment opportunities in many countries and with reasonable risk. And as a result, that savings is seeking safe assets like government bonds in the US and Germany, and as a result, those interest rates are incredibly low, including negative interest rates in Germany and Japan. The other feature of the new normal, as far as I can see, is technological change that seems to be shifting towards artificial intelligence, applications of artificial intelligence. At the same time, there's a very puzzling trend of slowdown in total factor productivity, TFP. In addition, there are also trends that are going to continue and happen to be, I think, important. Rising share of services in world production, declining shares of manufacturing and agriculture as part of share of GDP. There's also been a lot of talk about rising inequality, and there seems to be a backlash, so that we need to take that possibly into account and as part of the strategy of what needs to be done. And finally, there seems to be another new trend started since a year and a half ago, rising protectionism. This may be very temporary, I don't know, but I thought I should put it in as possible trend that it's not just United States, other countries may also follow suit, and the globalization is going to be partially reversed. So what are the challenges that these characteristics pose for MENA countries? Well, low oil prices obviously mean lower revenue for the region, and that makes it more difficult to have higher savings and investment. Real interest rates are low. That's probably could be a positive side, but the oil exporters were counting on creating wealth funds in order to stabilize their income. And if interest rates are low, the returns to those funds are going to be lower, and that could, at least for some countries, be an issue. In terms of technological development, many MENA countries have been lagging, and I'm going to show some evidence of that. So that's another problem. If AI and technology are the leading factors or major factors in the new normal, what's the implication for Middle Eastern countries? Especially what is amazing is that while there's been slowdown in TFP around the world. In the case of MENA, it's been actually declining. And I think that's very much related to the reduced labor productivity that Mustafa pointed out. The other feature that I mentioned, declining share of manufacturing in the world production, that also creates another challenge, because in the past there was the idea that developing countries could export more, especially in manufacturing and possibly agriculture, but mostly manufacturing was the more dynamic part that they could export. That's the tradable sector, and be able to pull themselves out of poverty. But with the manufacturing shrinking, those options might be actually much more limited, so a China-like or Korea-like strategy may not work. At the same time, there's a lot of demand for reduced inequality as Middle Eastern countries, which showed a lot of commitment to redistribution, at least towards the poor, shifted towards market in the past 10 years, the past 30 years. They ended up creating a lot of tension, and possibly one of the causes of the uprisings around the region may be rooted in shifts in growth strategies and redistribution strategies. So if there's greater challenge to bring about more equality, that's going to be, it's not, in terms of timing, it's not going to be very good for Middle Eastern countries. As they want to solve other problems, they have to address this other issue as well. And protectionism, again, makes trade options more limited. But as I'm going to argue, there may be some new opportunities as well for growth in the new normal. Most of these features are not looking good for the region. Okay, so let me start by some evidence on TFP. I used the World Pen Tables data to calculate the average TFP in the region with putting GDP as weights on TFP indices of different countries. Here I have three groups of countries. The dark line is OECD countries, defined based on which countries were part of OECD before 1990. There new countries that joined OECD later on are included in the rest of the country groups. The one on top here that is declining, this is oil exporting countries outside MENA, and the rising curve down here is the TFP of non-MENA countries that do not export oil. And you can see that this group of countries has been the most successful. I have normalized everything to make sure that the TFP is equal to 1 for all countries in 2011. As a result, a rise here shows that this group of countries has been the most successful. And the other very visible thing here is the decline in growth rate or the rise of the TFP index across countries, especially developed countries. If I superimpose here what has happened in the Middle East and North Africa, the Middle East and North Africa basically moved along the other oil exporting countries in the rest of the world. Even the non-oil exporting countries in MENA countries are behaving more like the non-MENA oil exporting countries compared to the more successful group down here. And what is particularly notable here is since 2010, there's been a quite visible drop in total factor productivity in the region compared to its counterpart regions around the world. So now, in order to sort of derive some conclusion of what needs to be done, what has happened around the world, let me just point out some of the thoughts about why TFP has slowed down and what does it imply for the Middle East. The trend is puzzling, but there are some possible explanations. For example, it seems that R&D ratios have been rising across country groups, and MENA countries have lagged behind. So here's the data on this. In all country groups, share of R&D in GDP has gone up, but MENA countries, in the past at least, especially the oil exporting countries, did not have very high ratios of R&D to GDP. That has grown, but still lags behind the countries that are most successful in the world, which all of them are putting about 3 times more or 4 times more than Middle Eastern countries put into research and development. And of course, developed countries put a lot more in research and development. MENA non-oil countries are doing somewhat better than the oil exporting countries in the region, but even those numbers are not that high. They're not more than 1/2 of what's happening around the world. So what are the further possible explanations and decline in MENA, TFP, and also this slowdown elsewhere around the world? What we see, one of the factors that seems to be explaining the slowdown in TFP growth is that when you look at specific countries, within each country, there are a limited number of firms that have very large, they're very large, and they make massive investments in artificial intelligence. Right now, the group that is known as FANG, for example, in the United States, or BAT in China, are these leading companies. And they are very profitable. They remain lead firms in their sectors. They also take advantage of low interest rates that enable them to invest a lot. But this productivity growth among the top firms does not seem to trickle down to smaller and medium-sized firms. And the slowdown has been also associated with the slowdown in entry of new firms, especially small firms. And even in rising industries, we don't see a whole lot of entry by new firms compared to the past. And it seems that the domination of these dynamic firms like Google or Amazon has actually caused deterrence for entry of smaller firms, new firms, and as a result, productivity growth remains rather limited to these more successful firms. So along with that, we see also in many countries around the world reduced or stagnant investment GDP ratios. And also, economic complexity doesn't seem to be rising in many countries. The economic complexity measure is the measure developed at MIT that looks at what the type of products and complexity of products being produced and exported. And this seems to be particularly a problem in the MENA countries. The investment doesn't seem to be adequate, and also complexity has been stagnant in the region. So here's the data. And in terms of investment, again, the 3 groups of countries I had for comparison: developed countries, OECD, other non-MENA, non-oil countries. They've done relatively well in terms of investment, and they've raised their investment. The data from that Mustafa Nabli also indicated similar results. In terms of investment in oil exporting countries, that's been quite much lower compared to the non-oil countries around the world. Now, when we add Middle Eastern countries to this, as far as investment is concerned, they seem to be doing okay, but still they're below the leading countries countries that are doing much better in terms of investment and economic growth. So that's what I mean by inadequate. There may be some potential for increasing investment, and that's domestic savings, and that Mustafa pointed out might be a solution to this, to raise the level of investment in the Middle East closer to the leading countries like China or Korea or other countries that have done very well. In terms of economic complexity, here are the indices, again, weighted averages from around the world. And you can see here that, again, there's one group of countries, non-MENA, non-oil countries that have been doing very well. The rest, MENA basically has been relatively stagnant in these terms in recent years, and even developed countries have been falling behind in these terms compared to rising powers, economic powers like China and India. So the shift also from the structural change that I mentioned earlier, going from agriculture and manufacturing towards services, has also implications for the region and its growth strategy. So the reasons for this shift are well known. There's changes in nature of demand, and demand for services have been rising, but also manufacturing has been broken into, the processes have been broken down, and some of them that had service nature have been shifting into services and even being outsourced. So that may be part of the problem. It's not that manufacturing is declining, but it's also transforming the way it's producing. What is also happening at the same time is that the new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, is being used in order to enhance the productivity of manufacturing by leading firms around the world. And that, again, has been a driver of slow entry of firms and also in driving out some lagging firms from the market. So given these circumstances for MENA, the implication is that there are fewer opportunities of growth in manufacturing exports based on the old strategies of cheap, low-skilled labor, and there's greater need for higher quality labor, shifting towards high-tech production in all sectors, whether it's agriculture or manufacturing or services. One needs to come up with policies to broaden the opportunities for skill acquisition, deeper integration into global value chains in order to take advantage of these transformations in the way manufacturing is changing. My conclusion is that one has to move towards smart industrial policy. So this can be done by providing support for firms to enter and grow through incubators, accelerators, and industrial service clusters. The skill acquisition needs to be enhanced. Attention needs to be paid to the effects of networks and economies of scale, given the new conditions in the world, new nature of production the way the nature of production is changing in the world. Integrating into global value chains is important, and the countries in the region need to design also strategies for navigating potential rise of protectionism in other countries, especially in the US and possibly in Europe. Within MENA, marketing integration is going to be also very important. So you might say, I'm advocating industrial policy and go back to the old story of bureaucrats picking winners. I want to make a case for industrial policy, and basically following what Professor Lee started the conference with that idea. So I see in this debate whether there should be industrial policy or not, whether government should be picking winners or not, as an artificial dichotomy. One key issue is that there are market failures that need to be addressed, and they're complex and not easy to identify. So one may need to have some sort of private-public partnership in shaping policies. So when we talk about industrial policy needs to take into account realities of markets and the economy. And it needs to overcome hurdles and inertia in markets, in some parts of the economy, generate ideas for where things might be going, shape perceptions and educate not just entrepreneurs to figure out what they need to do, but also bureaucrats need to be informed about what is going on in the economy, what's the best policy, and learn about where industry is going. And that means that they should be involved in the process of selecting, deciding what needs to be done. Also, if there's some sort of private-public partnership in shaping policies, there may be a lot more commitment on the part of the government. This issue that Mustafa Nabli raised, the issue of generating political support, political consensus behind policies is very important, and that's the first step. I think beyond these kinds of debates, engaging the public and the private sector together and bringing it to public arena is very important to engage various parts of civil society in thinking about what policies work, which ones don't work, and it could help ensure broader distribution of the benefits potentially. It could also generate political support for the policies that are going to be eventually adopted. But trying to just get the government to be a hands-off government and only do the basics and let the private sector to take off, I don't think is going to work in the coming decades. So in the Middle East and North Africa, there are regions, countries that are doing very well or have started moving in these directions. Especially, I see a lot of news and information and also evidence that in UAE especially and the rest of GCC, we see major changes in policy. Other MENA countries need to mobilize their economic and political resources and design and implement their own versions of this kind of industrial policy. Thank you.